On Renata's first day at the Ashford penthouse, she had barely set her bag down in the hallway when Miles appeared at the top of the stairs, looked her over from head to toe, and said, "Oh, interesting. Gail hired the building." Then he walked away laughing. Renata had heard worse. She kept her face still and followed Gail toward the east wing. What she hadn't been prepared for was the room at the end of the corridor, where Luca Ashford sat in the dim glow of a single desk lamp, his face turned toward the window. He didn't acknowledge her when she walked in. Gail introduced her gently, explained that Renata would be helping with his daily routine and staying on the premises, and hoped Luca would try to cooperate. Luca turned then. He looked at Renata the way someone looks at a delivery they didn't order. He reached for the small whiteboard propped against his bedside table, uncapped the marker, and wrote 3 words. "She won't stay." He held it up for exactly 2 seconds, then erased it himself. "He's been through a great deal," Gail said softly, as though that explained everything. Renata nodded. She had driven 4 hours from Sudbury for this job. She was not driving back. Renata grew up in a house that backed onto a gravel lane in a part of Sudbury that didn't make it into the tourism brochures. Her mom, Loretta, worked shift work at a diner for most of Renata's childhood, then took on cleaning contracts when the diner shut down. They managed. That was the word Loretta used. We manage. They kept the heat on through the winter. They kept food in the house. Renata had understood the rules of their life early and never asked for things she knew they couldn't afford. What she couldn't control was her body. By the time she hit grade 7, she was already the largest girl in her class, and her classmates had made sure she knew it. The comments followed her from elementary school through to graduation. She had them memorize the way other kids memorized song lyrics. She stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria by grade 9. She sat in the library instead and read whatever she could reach from the shelves, which turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her. She wasn't the fastest learner in the room, but she was patient, and she was stubborn, and she remembered things. Her marks were steady enough to get through, though university had been something she'd quietly stopped expecting. There was no money for it, and she'd never found the right moment to tell Loretta how badly she'd once wanted it. So she didn't. She carried it and moved forward. She graduated at 18, came home, and started working. 2 years of seasonal farm contracts outside the city, a few months at a grocery warehouse, and then a year helping an elderly neighbor named Arthur with his errands and household tasks after his wife passed. Arthur paid her fairly. He never mentioned her size or her background. He just said thank you and meant it. That year with Arthur was the one Renata returned to in her mind when people asked how she'd ended up in caregiving. When Loretta's sister-in-law, a woman named Bev who'd moved to Toronto years earlier, called to say a wealthy family downtown was looking for a live-in caregiver for their adult son, Renata had asked only 2 questions: how long and when to start. The answers were open-ended and immediately. She packed a bag that night. The Ashford penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower in the downtown core with a direct view of the lake. Warren Ashford had built his contracting company from a 2-truck operation in the early 90s into one of the larger construction firms in Ontario. Gail managed the family's finances with a precision Renata quietly admired. They were not the kind of wealthy people who made you feel small for noticing. They were polite and direct and visibly exhausted with worry. Their son Luca had been, by all accounts, the kind of person who filled a room. He'd taken over daily operations at Ashford Group at 26. He read constantly. He had a reputation for listening before he spoke, for remembering what people told him weeks later and asking about it unprompted. People liked him in the specific way people like someone who makes them feel genuinely seen. Then, 8 months ago, a transport truck ran a red light on the Gardner Expressway, and the rest of Luca's carefully structured life cracked down the middle. The physical damage could have been far worse. The accident left him with fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and severe trauma to his larynx. The ribs healed, the shoulder healed. His voice did not come back the way anyone had hoped. He could whisper, short, painful sentences that cost him something each time. The doctors had told him vocal cord rehabilitation was entirely possible, but it required consistent daily therapy and exercises. He'd quit after 2 sessions. He had been in his room, curtains mostly drawn, ever since. Renata had been told all of this by Gail before she arrived. She'd also been quietly informed that the 6 caregivers before her had lasted between 3 days and 2 weeks. She had noted that information and said nothing about it. What she hadn't been told about was Miles. Miles was Gail's nephew, 23, currently between apartments and staying in the guest suite on the upper floor while he figured things out, which, as far as Renata could observe, meant sleeping until noon and arriving at mealtimes in expensive athletic wear to make observations no one had requested. By the end of the first week, she had been called large, called a unit, and, her personal favorite, structurally impressive. Miles offered these with such breezy confidence that she was never quite sure whether he expected her to laugh. She didn't laugh. She also didn't take the bait. She had stopped performing reactions for people like Miles a long time ago, and she wasn't about to start again. What she did instead was learn. She asked Edna, who had worked for the Ashfords for 11 years and ran the household with calm authority, everything she could think of. What did Luca eat before the accident? He preferred savory over sweet, ate plain yogurt and fruit without complaint, tolerated coffee but preferred tea, strong and plain. What did he do with his time? Reading, business texts and literary fiction in rotation, squash 3 times a week, and unexpectedly, woodworking. He had a small workshop at a friend's property east of the city. He hadn't been back to it since the accident. What did he miss? Edna paused on that one for a moment. Outside, she said. He used to run along the waterfront every single morning. Renata wrote none of it down. She didn't need to. Getting into Luca's room was its own project. He tolerated her presence as long as she was functional and unobtrusive. The whiteboard was his entire vocabulary with her. Water. Medicine. Leave. He didn't ask about her and didn't explain himself. The first time she moved toward the window curtains, he had already written "don't" before her hand reached the rod. The first time she sat down in the chair beside his window, without being asked to do anything in particular, he looked at her for a full minute with an expression she couldn't quite decode. "Why are you still here?" he wrote. "I have nowhere else to be for the next hour," she said. He studied her. Then he picked up his book. She took that as permission and stayed. Edna told her about Dr. Carson on the 3rd week. The speech pathologist made visits to the penthouse every 2 weeks because Luca had refused the clinic. Each session lasted under 20 minutes before he went still in that particular way that meant he was done. Dr. Carson had told Warren and Gail plainly that without consistent daily practice, the therapy would not progress. Luca was aware of this. He did it anyway. The day Dr. Carson came for the 4th visit since Renata had arrived, she waited until the doctor was gathering her bag to leave, then stepped into the hallway. "Is there something I can do?" Renata asked. "Something specific. Could you show me the exercises? I could do them with him." Dr. Carson gave her a measured look. The previous caregivers were asked not to be present during sessions. "I'll ask him myself." The doctor left a printed guide of the daily exercises without being asked twice. Renata appreciated that. That evening she sat across from Luca and put the guide on the table between them. He glanced at it. "No." "I know," she said. "You say no to most things, the curtains, eating a full plate, letting anyone sit in the room, the exercises." He waited. "I want to make a deal with you." "I don't make deals." "You will with this one." She straightened in the chair. "Give me 2 months. I'll do the exercises with you every single day. You don't have to speak during them. You just have to show up for 20 minutes. In return, I have something I'm committing to as well." "What?" She had been thinking about this for nearly a week before she said it. "I've been overweight my entire life. I've never seriously tried to change it. I want to lose 25 pounds in 8 weeks. I'm going to do it, run, eat properly, actually put in the effort. When I do, you give me 1 full month of real therapy, daily. No cutting sessions short, no sending Dr. Carson home early." Luca studied her. "And, if you don't, then I leave, voluntarily. You don't have to say a word." She could see him calculating the odds. She was fairly certain he thought she wouldn't manage it. She was also certain he understood she wasn't bluffing. He erased the board and wrote 1 word. "Fine." She started the next morning before 6. The building had a gym on the 4th floor she'd walked past twice without going in. She went in now. She ran until her legs were unsteady, then walked until she could breathe again, then ran some more. She ate the things Edna quietly helped her figure out. Simple, satisfying, nothing from a package. She stopped finishing food simply because it was on the plate in front of her. Warren noticed the change before anyone said anything. Miles noticed and said something immediately, because Miles always did. "You've actually lost weight," he said one morning, pouring coffee with the air of someone making a scientific observation. Like, genuinely. "Thank you for your thorough analysis," Renata said. He grinned. Something in the grin had shifted lately. It was less a sneer and more something that looked, reluctantly, like respect. She wasn't certain that was better, but she noted it. With Luca, things moved in small increments. The daily exercises started on a Tuesday. The first session he lasted 11 minutes before setting the guide down. She said nothing and left. The next day he went 14. By the second week he was going the full 20 consistently, and something in the room had changed in a way she didn't have a precise word for. She started reading aloud in the evenings, whatever book was close to hand. He began recommending things via the whiteboard, which told her he had opinions about what she chose and didn't entirely hate having her there. He had a dry sense of humor that came through in writing. When she picked up a thriller he'd apparently already read, she found a note in his handwriting on the inside cover. The ending is obvious by chapter 4. Don't say I didn't warn you. She found it on page 41 and wrote under his note with a borrowed pen, "You were right, I genuinely resent that." He smiled when he read it. A real one. It was the first she'd seen from him clearly, and she found herself thinking about it later in her room in a way that made her vaguely uncomfortable. Miles asked her to dinner in the 6th week. They were in the kitchen. She was making tea. He had drifted in for no apparent reason, when he leaned against the counter and said, "What if we actually went somewhere? Dinner, out, a proper one." Renata looked at him for a moment. "I'm serious," he said. "I know you are, that's why I'm taking a second." She didn't enjoy this part, even with someone who'd called her structurally impressive. "You've been different lately," she told him honestly. "I've noticed it, and I like talking to you more than I expected to when I first got here. But I don't feel that way about you, I'm sorry." Miles was quiet for a moment, then he nodded once, looking at the counter. "Okay," he said, "that's fair." He picked up his mug. At the doorway he stopped. "For the record, whoever you do feel that way about is lucky." He left before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen with her tea going warm in her hands, already knowing exactly who she felt that way about, and finding the knowledge considerably more frightening than Miles's question. 8 weeks after the bet, Renata had lost 27 pounds. She walked into Luca's room on a Sunday afternoon and stood where the light came through the window, which she'd opened 3 weeks ago without asking, and he had let her. He looked at her, really looked, in that way he had when he was paying full attention. "You did it," he wrote. 27, I said 25. Overachiever. "You remember our deal?" He set the whiteboard down and was still for a moment. Then he nodded. She called Dr. Carson that afternoon. The proper program began Monday. The work was harder than the exercises had been. Luca's voice when he used it was barely audible, a rough, effortful sound that clearly came at a cost. There were mornings when he stopped after 5 minutes and sat with his eyes closed, and Renata waited across from him without filling the silence. There were sessions where something progressed, and they both felt it. And he'd write something afterward on the whiteboard that made her laugh. And she noticed him watching her laugh in a way that was increasingly difficult to categorize as professional. One evening she came back from a run to find him standing at the window, not sitting in the chair near it, actually standing, weight on both feet, looking out at the waterfront in the early dark. "You're up," she said. He turned. His voice came out deliberately, rough-edged but controlled, present in a way it hadn't been when she arrived. "You're sweaty." She went very still. He looked faintly embarrassed and reached for the whiteboard out of habit. She held up a hand. "Don't," she said. "Say it again." A pause, then, "You're sweaty." It was possibly the least romantic sentence in the English language. She started laughing and couldn't stop, and he watched her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something unguarded and almost wondering. The trouble with Portia came the following month. Portia Whitmore had been Luca's executive assistant at Ashford Group before the accident. She was thorough and professional, and over 8 months had quietly absorbed more and more of what had been his responsibilities. When Luca began attending short meetings, first by video, then briefly in person, Portia's behavior began to change. Misfiled reports, a client message that arrived 2 days late, an appointment quietly dropped from the calendar. Then Warren called Renata into his study one Wednesday morning with a careful expression and showed her a printed email addressed to a business journalist. It contained private details about Luca's condition, his therapy progress, his timeline for returning to work. The address it had been sent from looked almost exactly like hers. One letter was different. Renata read it twice. "I didn't write this." "I know your address," Warren said. This one was designed to look like it. Gail was already calling the family's lawyer. Renata sat in the study and felt something go cold and familiar in her chest. That particular feeling of being handed a conclusion she had no part in reaching. Luca came in 15 minutes later. He didn't go to his parents first. He sat directly across from her, picked up a pen, not the whiteboard, a pen, and wrote on a notepad. Did you? No. He tore the page off and set the pen down. Find out who did, he said to his father. Warren's contact traced the email to a device registered to Portia Whitmore within 2 days. When she was confronted, she did not take long to explain herself. She hadn't intended to harm Luca, she said. She'd wanted to control what was being said about the company during his absence. She hadn't thought the suspicion would fall on Renata. She said this as though it made it better. Portia was gone by the end of the week. Luca came to Renata's room that evening. She heard the knock and opened the door. He was standing in the corridor with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking like someone who had been working up to something for longer than the walk down the hall. I didn't doubt you, he said. The words were careful and deliberate, the way his words always were now, chosen because they were worth the effort. I want you to know that. I know, she said. I'm not good at this, he paused at saying things. Clearly. You're getting better at it. He looked at her for a long moment. I think I started getting better because of you. She didn't answer immediately. She leaned against the doorframe and waited. I don't want you to leave, he said. When I don't need a caregiver anymore, I don't want you to go. What do you want, then? I want you to stay because you want to, not because it's a job. Renata looked at him, standing in the corridor with the overhead light behind him, looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless since longer than she'd admitted to herself. I've wanted to stay for a while, she said. I just didn't think it was my place to say it first. Something in his expression shifted, careful relief perhaps, or something close to it. It's your place, he said. The months after that were not without difficulty. His voice came back unevenly, some days clearer than others, some mornings where he reached for the whiteboard, out of old habit, and caught himself. He and Warren worked out a gradual return to Ashford Group, taking back responsibilities in stages. He started going to the waterfront again in the early mornings, first walking the path, then eventually running. Renata sometimes ran with him. She had kept up the habit long after the bet was finished, not because of a number on a scale, but because it was the first time in her adult life she had done something physically demanding for herself and not stopped. Loretta came to Toronto in the spring. Gail hosted dinner, and Renata spent the evening watching her mother try not to look too impressed by everything around her. Afterward, Loretta pulled her aside and said, "You look different." Renata waited. "You look like yourself," Loretta said. "The version of yourself I always knew was in there somewhere." Miles moved into his own apartment in February and was seeing someone, a woman he'd met at a birthday dinner, easy and uncomplicated, and came around for meals occasionally with a lightness that had nothing tangled in it anymore. The first time he came to dinner after Renata and Luca had quietly become something more, he shook Luca's hand and said, "She's better than both of us, you realize." Luca agreed without hesitating, which Renata found unnecessarily quick. Warren proposed a junior administrative role at Ashford Group. Renata took 3 days to answer and then said yes. She made mistakes at the start. She sent a report to the wrong distribution list. She mislabeled a folder that took Phil a day and a half to sort out. She apologized for these things, fixed them, and learned them. Luca never held them over her. He would note what went wrong, explain the correct process, and move on as though the matter was already in the past. She found this harder to be grateful for than she'd expected, because she kept bracing for something that didn't come. On an evening in late October, they were sitting on the balcony, with the lake going dark, and the city lit up all around them, and Luca said, "I thought I had lost everything that mattered when I lost my voice." Renata waited. "I was wrong about that," he said. His voice was steadier now, not the same as it had been before the accident, maybe never going to be exactly that again, but present and entirely his own. "I found things I wouldn't have found if none of it had happened." "Are you about to say something decent?" she said. "Or are you going to make me sit here and guess?" He turned to look at her directly. "I love you," he said. Simple, no whiteboard needed. Renata smiled. "I know." He gave her a look. "That's it?" "I love you too," she said. "I just wanted to see your face first." He shook his head, and she laughed, and the city went on doing what cities do below them, moving. and humming and full of people walking into things they hadn't expected to find. Renata had come to Toronto with one bag and very little certainty about what she was walking into. She hadn't planned on a family that became something close to her own, or a man who had learned to make every word count because each one had cost him something. She hadn't planned on discovering, at 28, what it felt like to be in a room and take up exactly as much space as she was owed. But the life that's waiting for you rarely announces itself. Sometimes it's just a whiteboard in a dim room, and a door you decide not to walk back out of, and the slow and stubborn work of choosing to stay.